This is the Flytanium Arcade, and it is a really good debut to folding knives for Flytanium. So, quick background. Flytanium here, for those of you who don't know, has been one of the most popular aftermarket parts makers for knives for the last half decade or so. You can get little scales like this. These are scales for the Delica, review coming up on those. You can get aftermarket titanium hardware. They make stuff for Benchmade. They make stuff for Spyderco. They have for a while, and they've done quite well with that. They are, at least they seem to be, probably the most prominent and I would expect the best-selling aftermarket parts maker for Benchmades and Spydercos, now the AD 20.5, some other stuff like that. A couple of years ago, maybe a little more than a year ago, probably more than that by now, they started making balisongs, which were their first knives that they made in-house. And this, last year, the Arcade, was their first folding locking knife. And this is a $200 knife made in Taiwan. Actually, it doesn't say that on the blade here, but it's made in Taiwan. 3.2-inch blade, 126,000 stock, 3.2 ounces as a whole, and has the shark lock as its locking mechanism. Just to finish our sort of overall specs, these are 2 of 3 versions that debuted. One in raw aluminum, and this is an aluminum handle. One in raw aluminum, one in OD green aluminum, and there's another one in black aluminum. And then you've got these inlays here. This one's micarta. This one is a Dayglow G10. And then the black one had Ultim inlays as well. These inlays are swappable, and we'll talk about that a little bit more later. I'm going to take this one off the screen now. We're going to focus on this one. So this ended up being, when I looked at it, I thought this might be a bit of a cash grab. Sometimes first knife designs don't go so well unless, a knife designer or a knife company does something like bring in a veteran designer, like, say, Spartan did with bringing in Bill Harsey to design their Spartan Harsey. And then you look at this, it looks like a pretty neutral handle. Kind of feels like this might be just, it's another knife. But there were a lot of really smart things that Flytanium did on the Arcade that make this knife way better than at least I expected, and in fact make it one of the most impressive knives of 2023. So let's get into why. We'll start with this blade. So this blade is a bog standard clip point. It's a very well done clip point, but it is a very, very standard clip point. And in fact, this clip point looks almost exactly like some of Demco's clip points, where there's not very much clip on that point. You take that line, you drew it out straight, you're only clipping off the very tip, and the swedge is doing most of the clipping. You've got relatively ornamental jimping. It does give you some grip, but the stonewash, which, by the way, great stonewash on the blade, looks very nice. But the stonewash has knocked down most of the edges on that jimping. So it's not like it gives you a ton of grip. It's more for indexing. It's more so your thumb knows exactly where it is relative to the blade. It gives you a dedicated spot to post up on top of the blade, which is fine for me, particularly for a knife sort of this style, which can move toward harder use, but isn't really a hard use knife by design. This is meant to be more of an EDC. But this standard clip point blade shape works just fine. It's about as standard and plain and normal as any blade shape you're going to find in the industry. The tip is about in line with the back of the scales. It's a little bit higher than the pivot. It pierces very naturally and nicely. The way they narrow this down, it comes down to a pretty thin and pokey tip. So this does pierce really nicely. It's easy to get up and around things. This worked pretty well in the garden. This worked well for some EDC tasks. It's not that tall of a blade, so it's easy to get wherever you need to get it. It's hard to talk too much about a blade shape this basic because, honestly, if you've used a blade, if you've used a knife, you've probably used a blade shape that's exactly like this, and it's sort of good at everything, exceptional at nothing. And that's fine. Especially because this grind here, and especially this edge, because this is still the factory edge. I have not felt the need to sharpen this because the factory edge and the factory grind came really, really good. 126 thousandths isn't thin stock. It's not thick stock. It's about the same as your native. In fact, it's probably a little bit thicker than the native, but not that much thicker than the native. It's probably about the same as your Spyderco Manix. It's a little bit thinner than something like your, get it here, sorry, bump the camera, a little thinner than your PM2, which looks a little chunky in comparison. So you got a pretty moderate blade stock here, and not that tall of a grind. But the way that they have ground this with a pretty aggressive flat grind, it does come down to a very keen edge. And this has been more than sharp enough for anything that I have needed for EDC. Even for tasks that tend to really prioritize edge sharpness a little bit more, like gardening, where when you're starting to cut some more delicate plant material, you really feel whether that edge is sharp or not. This came to me with a really good edge. Just cuts right into your cardboard, your tape, your paper, your things like that. Cuts really nicely into your plant material, and is still a thick enough blade that I would be comfortable pushing this knife a little bit harder. It's not dainty, it's not delicate, it's stout, it's robust. And they chose S35VN for your blade steel, which, when you consider everything that's going on in this knife, and you consider that they got it for $200, which for a made in Taiwan knife isn't cheap, but it's also not expensive. I am totally okay with S35VN. In fact, I like the choice of S35VN here. I like it over 20CV or M390. You're getting a steel that is significantly tougher than those options. And I think with this very sort of general utility blade shape, I mean, this isn't like a Warney or something. This isn't some skinny little knife that's meant to just slice. This isn't some Warney that's just meant for Wharncliffe, that's just meant for EDC tasks. This is really meant to be, if you look at the blade shape, and a little bit of everything sort of knife. This is meant to be something you can use for your, construction tasks or your tasks around the house, things like that. This blade shape, this blade thickness with S35VN gives you a lot of general utility. This is going to be something that can play into whatever role you want it to when you're just looking at that blade. Again, stonewash is really nice. Grind is surprisingly good. Edge is good enough that I haven't felt the need to resharpen it. So honestly, this blade ended up being very impressive. Not in anything in its design. It is a very simply designed blade, but it was executed at a very high level. And in fact, and we'll come back to this comparison every once in a while. So this is your Demco 80-20.5 and the slicer grind. This is probably made at the same factory as the AD-20.5. They're both made in Taiwan. And the stonewash looks identical. The factory edge looks identical. They're using literally the exact same shark lock. Like if you look at it, it is the same lock. You could literally probably take this part and put it in the other and vice versa. Demco these days gets very good grinds on their 80-20.5. They didn't used to. They do now. So if you had an 80-20.5 and you liked a current 80-20.5 from the last year or so, and you liked the grind on those, this is a very similar grind, except it's even taller than the grind on the 80-20.5 slicer, so it's going to cut even a little better. Another little detail I like on the blade, Flytanium was very clever in a lot of the things that they did with the aftermarket scales and things like that, which you would expect. That's their specialty. So this thumb stud. Not my favorite thumb stud by itself. It's a little close to the handle. It's not quite as grabby as I would like. It's fine. It's fine, but it's not amazing. It's just decent. But then I sort of learned why they set it up like this. This is basically a Benchmade thumb stud. And in fact, the Flytanium Arcade is compatible with any Benchmade thumb stud. Meaning you could literally take your thumb studs off your Benchmades, off your bug out, off your bailout, whatever, and put that thumb stud on here, and vice versa. Same size, same shape as a Benchmade thumb stud. You can also take the wide world of aftermarket Benchmade thumb studs, including some of which are made by Flytanium, and put any of those on here. That's kind of cool, Because if you want a big honkin' Benchmade thumb stud, you can get a big honkin' Benchmade thumb stud, and you can put that right here on the Arcade. Now, the thumb stud's pretty close to scale, so you can't put some of your huge ones on there, but honestly, I can't fault that decision. The Benchmade thumb stud is not my favorite. Again, it's a little small. I would like to have a little bit more purchase there. I would like it to stick out a little bit more from the scale, because you can see these thumb studs are not proud of the scales. They're even with the top of that scale. But the fact is, once you get used to it, very naturally positioned, the line between the pivot and the thumb stud is right in the sense that your angle of attack is pretty much perpendicular to it. Very light detent. So, you can see I put almost any pressure on it and it will start to move. That's a consequence of the shark lock. It's a spring-based lock, so you don't get that crisp break. And, I can either roll it out just like that, or I can absolutely flick it out. Tend to use a little wrist. But the thumb studs are fine, but the customizability is there, which is pretty cool. You got the Flytanium name and logo right there. On the other side, you've just got the blade seal, so this is a very sterile blade, which is nice. So the blade, and really nice plunge grind here. Again, the execution on the blade is very, very good. So that's the blade. Honestly, again, nothing innovative whatsoever on the design, but very well executed and has done everything I need a blade like this to do. Onto the handle, which the handle is the part that really surprised me the most. So first, let's talk about the shark lock. Shark lock is Demco's design. This is, I believe, the first non-Demco product that has officially licensed the shark lock. Snextan's Super Lock is very similar in a lot of ways to the shark lock, but it's not the exact same design. Certainly doesn't look or feel the same. This is, as I showed before, literally the shark lock off the AD 20.5 put in a different knife, which is part of why I think these are from the same factory. And it has everything that is great about the shark lock here too. You pull this lock back, and then the blade will pretty much swing free. This one, I have the pivot a little tight, so it's a little bit more of a shake-shut action. But it's super secure, super strong in the open position. In the closed position, basically, this is being held forward by a spring. That's sort of back here. And so, again, you don't get a crisp detent. I can pull this out right away without having to overcome any detent. But you just get a different action. It's a spring resistance. It's not a crack. And some people won't like that. You sort of get used to it. And honestly, from a practical perspective, it doesn't matter. That detent is really just an aesthetic, a feel thing. Once this is out, it's as locked in as any knife. And you got the benefit that this jimping on the shark fin there, which is what you pull back to release the blade, this jimping is very good jimping. It's shallow, but it's sharp. And you can absolutely put your thumb on there and get grip. There's not really any risk of accidentally pulling this thing back, because you got to pull it back pretty far before you disengage the blade. You can see it didn't disengage until I got all the way back here. And in fact, if I pull it back just a little bit and then try to, disengage the blade, it kind of locks up even harder. So it's not really a risk, even if you use this as a thumb ramp, of accidentally disengaging the blade. You really got to pull it to do that disengagement. So I really like the shark lock. One-handed operation. When you release it, your hands are entirely clear of the blade path, which I really like. That's the thing that I like the most about your axis locks, your shark locks, your ball locks, things like that, because I do have, a couple scars on a couple of my fingers from frame locks and liner locks that in one way or another have failed on me, either because I was an idiot or because the lock just failed. And those lock failures, especially when your hands are, in the cutting path, can really get you. There is definitely an added safety element when releasing the lock, your hands are entirely out of the cutting path. So that's really nice there, and it gives you that nice action. But these handles are shockingly well done in the sense that I was literally shocked at how much I enjoy these handles. So they are not thick. They're aluminum. This is raw aluminum here. They're not thick. If I pull out my PM2 here, you can see we are thinner than the PM2 by quite a bit, like by a lot actually. If we pull out it's probably about the same as your 80-20.5. Yeah, about the same there. If we pull out our native, thinner than a lot of your Spydercos, which is nice. Thin knives, and this is a thin neutral handle. I mean, this is basically, it's almost entirely flat across the back, with this little kick down here. It's mostly flat across the bottom with this little choil up here. You don't have a full forward finger choil, though you do have this little kick here. So it looks like, skinny and thin and neutral often means okay ergonomically. It's fine, it's easy to grip, it's easy to hold, but especially as you start to push it harder, those neutral handles often feel like they don't really hold your hand in place. They don't really keep your hand where you want it to be. But these chamfers do an immense amount of good for the Flytanium Arcade. You can see you've got a big, big chamfer all the way across the top, which goes right into that inlay. In fact, it might be even a little easier to see on this one here. Big chamfer carries into the inlay, becomes a smaller chamfer across the bottom. That chamfer extends a little bit on your finger choil here, and it's not the same chamfer the whole way around. They kind of did a little bit like what Chris Reeve did, where they vary the radius on that chamfer. And what this chamfer does, with flat scales on the edges, flat on the front, with that chamfer joining them, which is nicely knocked down everywhere, is it feels like a contoured handle. This gives you, those chamfers are big enough that when you grip down on this, you get that hand-filling feel where your hand is contacting all the way around this chamfer onto the flat back, all the way around the handle. It feels like a fully contoured handle, despite not being a fully contoured handle and giving you the bit of extra purchase that having a flat top and a flat side tends to give you. These chamfers make the knife feel really, really nice in the hand. In this grip here, which is sort of your standard grip, I get my first finger in the choil, 3 fingers safely in this back space. This little kick back here helps keep my fingers in place, and then I can either post my thumb up on this jimping, which is a little strained, or more naturally, I can post it up on this jimping on the back of the blade, which feels quite natural. Again, this jimping isn't giving me much grip, but it is helping me locate my thumb. This is a really comfortable grip. And even as I push this knife a little bit harder, this remains a really comfortable grip. And these chamfers, the way your fingers just sort of naturally roll onto the scale, it just works. It just feels really, really good in the hand. This aluminum is a little bit of a chalky texture, gives you just a little bit more grip. This micarta, it's micarta, gives you a little bit more grip as well. I like the micarta inlays best on this because I think, one, they look cool, and 2, they do give you more grip. The G10 inlays, you can see here, there is a little bit of texture on them. They're not flat. You've got this striped texture, but the stripes are basically so close together. It doesn't give you much grip. It really does if you really bear down on it, but honestly, it's better than flat G10, but this isn't as grippy a surface as the micarta, which is why I've used the micarta one much, much more. So this is my favorite version of the Flytanium Arcade. If you're gonna, if you're gonna get one, I think this is the one to start with, because the only way you can get these micarta inlays is through buying this knife right now. They don't sell micarta inlays separately. But anyway, this handle, because of these big chamfers, works really, really well in the hand. And this choil here, which it's kind of funny calling it a choil, it's not nearly a choil, but this little kick is more than enough to post my finger up on. I wouldn't, if I'm really bearing down on something, I wouldn't go to harder use tasks using this little kick. But if I'm, doing a delicate little cut, something like that, or if I'm, cutting across something and just want a little bit more purchase over the blade, I can absolutely use that front choil as a spot to put my finger, and it's plenty secure there, and I've got enough space that as long as I'm not pushing this hard, there's not a big risk of me riding up on the blade. It's just, and then if I want to, pinch up, I can put my middle finger there. Now this is really just for your, more delicate task, but I've used it this way. You can, pinch up by putting your fingers in this choil here, pinch the blade. It's got the benefits of a neutral handle. You can climb up and down this handle as you want to, but because of how well they did these chamfers here, it's so much more comfortable in the hand than I expected it to be. And on top of that, it's just really well balanced. One of the things that they did well by using aluminum handles here and a relatively thick blade stock is this, your balance point is about there. This is a very neutral feeling handle in the sense that it doesn't feel either blade heavy or handle heavy. And that just makes it feel very natural in the hand as you're using it. You don't have to think about controlling the knife, it's just sort of there. And so, just like they did with the blade, except for the inlays here, which we'll talk about in a second, there's nothing really innovative in the design about the handle, though you don't see this sort of design with big flats, with big chamfers quite that often these days. But they have executed this handle really, really well and much better than I expected. So it's, they're not innovating here per se, but they are executing really well. So now let's get to the sort of last part of the Flytanium Arcade, which is kind of cool, which is the aftermarket ability of it. So this is Flytanium. We'll bring this guy back out now. Flytanium makes aftermarket parts for everybody else's knives, and they already make a bunch of aftermarket parts for this knife. It debuted with a bunch of aftermarket parts. These inlays here, you pop a couple screws out, and you can swap them without even breaking down the whole knife. And that's kind of cool. Each of these come with 2 sets. They both come with the set that you're seeing now and a black G10 set with the exact same sort of little stripy pattern that you see on this one. You can get other G10 sets and they're like $21. In fact, they are $21. Relatively cheap. Great way to change the look of your knife. You can get titanium inlays for like $40. Not that bad in the scheme of things, and they've got a bit of a swirly pattern on there. You can even get, they're out of stock now, but you can get stuff like Mokutai inlays, and I'm sure there will be bunches more later. They're going to have micarta inlays. They're going to have, fat carbon inlays, I'm sure, stuff like that. That's one of the things about the arcade is these inlays are designed to be swapped, and you do whatever you want with them, and it's a relatively cheap and easy way to change the look of your knife and even change the feel of your knife a little bit. If you were to throw a brass or copper inlay in here, it would weight the knife a little bit more handle heavy because it's all the way back here at the butt. If you put, carbon fiber, it might even make it a tiny bit lighter than these. It's cool, and they priced those inlays right so that it's a nice thing to have. It's kind of like what TRM has done with their neutron and atom scales, where it's a relatively inexpensive way to make it feel like you have a little bit of a different knife. Now, it's just an inlay, it's not the whole scale. They haven't made whole scale swaps yet, but that will probably come in time as well. They also have hardware. You can get a full set of titanium hardware for, I think, $12, something ridiculous like that. So if you want to change the hardware color, Flytanium's got you there. They sell different thumb stud colors. They sell different clips. You can get a back spacer instead of these standoffs. If you want to start customizing your knife, you can do that right away. And it doesn't get that expensive. Part of the benefit of Flytanium doing this all themselves, and this is honestly part of the benefit of titanium manufacturing a lot of these parts overseas, at least the simpler parts, is, you can, if you turn this from a $200 knife into a $250 knife, you can throw a titanium inlay there and you can, get some custom hardware, and then you can make a knife that looks the way you want it to, which is cool. There's absolutely no practical benefit to that. But especially if you're the sort of person that likes having a knife collection and you like variety for variety's sake, it's a cheaper and easier way sometimes to feel like you've got a little bit more variety, to have things you can change on the knives that you already like and enjoy, than to have to, get an entirely new knife and learn to enjoy that one. So Flytanium has done a very good job with the debut on those aftermarket parts. And they will probably be coming out with growing aftermarket support over time. Which is it's cool. It's a nice feature of the arcade. Like everything else, they're not innovating here, but they've done it well. And that's really my conclusion on the Flytanium Arcade. This ended up being one of the best knives of 2023. The shark lock was a really good decision to use. It's a great locking mechanism, gives this something distinctive, something that brings people's attention, and honestly, practically, it's a really good light, or good lock. I combined lock and knife into life. It gives you just enough. For me, I'm not bothered by the lack of detent. It's just a springy detent instead. It's super secure. It's easy to actuate. Keeps your fingers out of the blade path. Gives you a little extra jimping on the back. Looks kind of cool to see that little shark fin there. And then both the blade and handle are simple designs, but executed at a very high level. Especially considering this is a $200 knife. They did everything very, very well here. And you know, if you're familiar with your AD 20.5 here, it's about the same level of execution on the blade that you get from Demco's Taiwan production knives right now. And I would say these handles are probably even better machined, better made for a lot of people, especially for EDC tasks. This might even be the better handle. I had a separate video just on that, but these are, you know, your sort of hard use utility handles. These are more of your EDC handles. They're more neutral, they're more comfortable, and they're done really well. So when I think about, you know, what Flytanium was trying to do and what they did do on the arcade, I think they nailed what they were likely trying to do. They're not trying to innovate on design here, except for, you know, a little bit on what they're doing with the inlays. Instead, they're going to take what works in general about knives. Clip point blades work. Mid-size stock with pretty good grinds that come down to a pretty good edge, those work. Neutral handles, people love them, and they generally work. And then you throw some really good chamfers on here, works great. Aluminum, great material, especially at this price point, leads to a really nice balance, and people love to swap things out on their knives. They were not shooting for something that's going to change the industry here, except for maybe in the way that, you know, they're going to have their entire little Flytanium ecosystem that lets you grow and build this knife as you want to over time. And I'm certain this won't be the last arcade that we see either. They're going to come out with a Warncliffe blade shape. They're going to come out with different handle designs, stuff like that. So this ended up being just an impressively well-executed knife, and as a result, it was one that I have really enjoyed carrying a lot more than I thought I would. It's great for fidgeting, but it's also really good as a user. The handle is shockingly well designed and well executed in very subtle ways, and, you know, I was not the sort of person that I didn't really give the Flytanium Arcade much of a fair shake when I was looking at it. It kind of looked to me like another overseas-made, relatively neutral knife that, you know, there was nothing to stand out about the design. And I'm very glad that I tried it, because had I not given it a shot, I wouldn't have understood and felt just how well everything here was executed. So, really good work, Flytanium. I was very, very impressed by it, and I was impressed in ways I didn't expect to be impressed. I think if any part of this design speaks to you, give it a shot, and you will likely be impressed as well, because Flytanium has just done a great job here with their first locking folding knife. That's it for the Flytanium Arcade. And if you want to get a version, again, I think these micarta inlays are awesome. Only way you can get them is buying them with the knife. I would say start with this one, unless you really like this Dayglow Green, or, you know, if you happen to get the Ultim one, that one's sold out, and that's the only way to get Ultim. That's the arcade. Good knife. Hope you found this useful, and I will see you again soon.